Tensions in the South China Sea are at a boiling point, placing the Philippines at the epicenter of one of the world's most contentious maritime disputes. China's expansion in this region has wide-ranging implications, not just for the Philippines, but for global stability. From Beijing's naval buildup to the Philippines' bolstered ties with the United States, a clash is becoming an increasingly conceivable scenario. To grasp the potential consequences of such a conflict,
in the face of those rising tensions that we see now around the South China Sea and Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific regions,
we must dive into the historical roots, analyze China's strategic imperatives, including its stance on Taiwan, evaluate the military strengths of both sides, and explore the broader geopolitical context. To understand the Sino-Philippine dispute, we need to examine how territorial control in the South China Sea evolved over centuries. The area has historically been a hub for empires, colonial powers, and indigenous maritime communities, all vying for influence over vital sea routes and natural resources. China's territorial ambitions in the South China Sea trace back to the Han Dynasty, which set the foundation for its current claims via the Nine-Dash Line established much later. This historical assertion, albeit contested by its neighbors, is key to understanding China's enduring claims. The colonial era introduced new complexities. Spain, for instance, ruled the Philippines for over 3 centuries, prioritizing the control of regional sea lanes to secure trade routes. These imperial agendas were predominantly economic, with territorial squabbles periodically flaring between rival colonial forces. The South China Sea thus became a strategic maritime crossroad, contested by empires and naval forces as they sought to secure commerce and influence. Following World War II, the South China Sea morphed into a Cold War arena. The United States, aiming to contain communist China, cemented alliances with countries like the Philippines. Meanwhile, China began asserting its historical claims, gradually occupying islands and reefs. The discovery of substantial oil and gas reserves raised the stakes even higher. By the late 20th century, China had made concrete advances, seizing control of critical islands and stepping up its territorial claims, particularly in the 1990s. One flashpoint was the 2012 standoff at Scarborough Shoal, where China seized control, establishing a foothold near Philippine waters. The 2016 ruling by an international tribunal in The Hague invalidated China's extensive maritime claims, siding with the Philippines under international law.
The Philippines strongly affirms its respect for this milestone decision as an important contribution to ongoing efforts in addressing disputes in the South China Sea.
However, Beijing disregarded the decision, doubling down on its military buildup by creating artificial islands equipped with missiles, radar systems, and airstrips across the Spratly Archipelago. These fortified installations form the backbone of China's claim to the region, posing a direct challenge to the sovereignty and security of the Philippines. China's ambitions in the South China Sea are motivated by interwoven economic, military, and nationalist objectives. The region is essential to China's economy, as nearly 1/3 of global maritime trade flows through these waters. Beneath these contested waters lie vast oil and gas reserves, resources critical to China's long-term energy needs. But Beijing's drive extends beyond resource control. Its leadership views the South China Sea as a blue water bastion, integral to national security and prestige. By consolidating control over the region, China aims to solidify its role as Asia's undisputed hegemon, effectively deterring regional adversaries and challenging the US-led security framework. China's militarized islands, such as Fiery Cross and Subi Reefs, allow it to project power across Southeast Asia. positioning Beijing as a gatekeeper over key shipping routes and providing forward bases for any necessary military maneuvers against U.S. interests. Equally significant to China's strategy is Taiwan. Beijing regards Taiwan as a breakaway province, with its reunification seen as essential to China's great power aspirations. Securing Taiwan would enhance China's influence over the first island chain, reinforcing its dominance over the South China Sea and complicating any U.S. intervention. This dual pursuit of Taiwan and the South China Sea places China at odds with the U.S.-Philippines alliance, creating a scenario where a South China Sea conflict could precipitate broader hostilities. Beijing may view such a conflict as an opportunity to execute a swift takeover of Taiwan, banking on its ability to manage multiple crises while deterring American intervention. Control over both Taiwan and the South China Sea is thus integral to China's rejuvenation as a global power. Geographically and strategically, the Philippines occupies a unique position in the South China Sea conflict. With close proximity to contested areas like the Spratly Islands and Scarborough Shoal, it is squarely in the path of China's expansion. Beyond geographic proximity, the Philippines holds a critical legal advantage following the 2016 tribunal decision, positioning itself as a defender of international law in a region where China often flouts it. Nonetheless, the Philippines faces significant challenges in defending its interests. Compared to China, the Philippines maintains one of the region's least equipped militaries, despite efforts to modernize. In 2012, the Philippines launched its AFP, Armed Forces of the Philippines, Modernization Act to bolster its defense capabilities. While it has made strides in strengthening its national defense, its military remains limited in scope and scale. Yet the Philippines has something China lacks: a powerful ally in the United States. At the heart of the geopolitical chessboard lies the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, MDT, signed in 1951. This treaty is a cornerstone of Southeast Asia's security architecture, ensuring American support if the Philippines faces external aggression. Washington has repeatedly affirmed its commitment to this alliance. In 2023, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken reiterated that an armed attack on Philippine assets in the South China Sea would activate U.S. defense obligations under the MDT.
It's why we stand with the Philippines and stand by our ironclad defense commitments, including under the Mutual Defense Treaty. Article 4 extends to armed attacks on the Filipino armed forces, public vessels, aircraft, including those of its Coast Guard, anywhere in the South China Sea.
This assurance sends a clear message to Beijing that the U.S. will not tolerate unchecked Chinese expansion. Moreover, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, strengthens U.S.-Philippine ties by allowing American forces to rotate through Philippine bases. This access ensures that U.S. forces are strategically positioned to respond to any Chinese aggression in the region. Bases in Luzon and Palawan, near contested areas, enable rapid mobilization in the event of hostilities. As tensions over features like Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal escalate, the risk of miscalculation grows, potentially dragging the U.S. into a military standoff with China. Military analysts foresee a U.S. engagement strategy similar to its support of Israel in the Middle East, offering advanced weaponry, intelligence, and logistical support without direct troop involvement. Should the South China Sea descend into conflict, the U.S. would likely adopt a similar approach, empowering the Philippines while avoiding full-scale confrontation. A prolonged conflict would strain China economically and militarily, akin to Russia's experience in Ukraine. A conflict in the South China Sea would likely ignite over high-tension zones like Scarborough Shoal or Second Thomas Shoal, where Chinese gray zone tactics have repeatedly tested regional stability. China has deployed maritime militias and Coast Guard forces, often operating just below the threshold of war. However, if tensions reach a tipping point, conflict could escalate rapidly, drawing in powerful military assets with global repercussions. China's People's Liberation Army Navy plan is now the world's largest navy, with over 350 ships, including 3 aircraft carriers, 32 destroyers, and 76 submarines. It leverages advanced weapon systems, notably the DF-21D and DF-26 carrier killer missiles, which target enemy vessels from great distances. These assets are crucial to China's anti-access area denial A2AD strategy, designed to deter U.S. forces from approaching contested waters. However, China's naval prowess does not equate to battlefield superiority. Experts like James Holmes of the U.S. Naval War College argue that despite recent advancements, China's Navy lacks large-scale combat experience, with its last major naval engagement occurring in 1988. By contrast, the U.S. Navy operates 11 aircraft carriers globally, each capable of deploying substantial air and sea forces. Supported by allies like Japan, Australia, and South Korea, the U.S. could mount a coordinated response, challenging China's defenses. On the Philippines side, despite progress under the AFP Modernization Act, its capabilities remain limited. Its Navy fields only a few modern frigates, and its Air Force relies on aging aircraft. Should war erupt, Manila would heavily depend on U.S. logistical and combat support to counter China's fortified positions. The economic impact of a South China Sea conflict would reach far beyond the battlefield. Roughly $3.5 trillion in annual trade flows through these waters, amounting to 1/3 of global maritime commerce. Control over this region gives China leverage over critical trade routes and energy flows. An estimated 80% of China's energy imports transit through the South China Sea, making prolonged disruptions potentially disastrous for its economy. In a sustained conflict, the U.S. and its allies could impose economic blockades, crippling China's access to resources and straining its economy.
Game on here. A trade war between the United States and China is here.
We are looking at a reality that has, a 25% tariff on every single product that would come in from China.
China may experience reduced growth due to sanctions, with some studies estimating up to a 1% annual reduction, though the precise impact would vary depending on the scale and duration of the sanctions. Similarly, projections from economic analyses suggest that a prolonged conflict could significantly impact the Philippines' GDP, potentially shrinking it by several percentage points as trade disruptions, infrastructure damage, and military expenditures strain its economy. A conflict between China and the Philippines would not only devastate the local economy and infrastructure, but also force neighboring states to make difficult strategic decisions. Southeast Asia's middle powers, including Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, all have vested interest in the South China Sea and may be compelled to either align more closely with the U.S.-Philippines alliance or face growing Chinese influence. Each of these nations has its own territorial claims, and an armed conflict could either solidify their resolve to oppose Chinese expansion or prompt them to seek accommodations with Beijing. Vietnam, a vocal critic of China's territorial ambitions, could leverage a conflict scenario to assert its own claims. In recent years, Vietnam has significantly upgraded its naval capabilities and fostered closer security ties with the United States and India. Analysts at the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, AMTI, note that Vietnam's ambitions to deter Chinese incursions have driven it to invest in submarines, missile systems, and coastal defenses. If China and the Philippines go to war, Vietnam might escalate its own defenses or even engage in limited military actions to protect its interests, complicating China's position and potentially drawing in additional allies. For Indonesia and Malaysia, the stakes are equally high but require a different approach. Neither nation seeks an open confrontation with China, yet both are wary of Beijing's expansionist strategies. Indonesia has already experienced flare-ups with China over fishing rights near the Natuna Islands, and a full-blown conflict could exacerbate these tensions. Malaysia, with significant energy interests in the region, may find itself navigating a delicate balancing act, hedging between security partnerships and economic ties with China. Analysts suggest that these nations could adopt a wait-and-see approach, focusing on diplomatic solutions while quietly preparing for a potential spillover of hostilities. Beyond military calculations and economic forecasts, a conflict in the South China Sea would have severe humanitarian implications. The Philippines, with its extensive coastal communities, would face immediate threats to civilian infrastructure, including the displacement of hundreds of thousands of residents from critical areas like Palawan and Luzon. Key cities and bases in these regions would be prime targets, raising the risk of widespread casualties. The Philippine government's National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council has been instrumental in preparing for natural disasters. Yet conflict brings unique challenges that differ significantly from typhoons or earthquakes. The scale of potential evacuations and the need for sustained humanitarian assistance could overwhelm both local and international aid organizations. The United Nations and regional partners might step in to provide support, but large-scale displacement would strain the Philippines' social services and economy. Such displacement could have ripple effects across Southeast Asia, with refugees potentially fleeing to neighboring countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, or Vietnam. This humanitarian crisis would necessitate coordinated regional aid, presenting logistical and diplomatic challenges at a time when resources are stretched by the conflict.
We meet today as friends and partners, bound by a shared vision and pursuit of a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific.
A Sino-Philippine conflict, especially one that draws in the U.S., would reverberate far beyond Southeast Asia, signaling a new chapter in the global rivalry between Washington and Beijing. A prolonged conflict could push the world into an era of bifurcated global alliances and economic systems, with countries increasingly forced to choose between aligning with the U.S. or China. This schism would have wide-reaching implications for global trade, technology sharing, and even climate action, as the U.S. and China would likely vie for influence across various spheres of international governance. Analysts from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, warned that a protracted U.S.-China rivalry could lead to the decoupling of the global economy. In this scenario, countries may face mounting pressure to limit trade with either the U.S. or China, potentially triggering a rollback in globalization. For Southeast Asian economies, heavily reliant on both American and Chinese markets, such decoupling would force difficult choices, impacting supply chains, investment flows, and development projects. A conflict would also impact existing alliances and international organizations. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, long a champion of regional stability and neutrality, would face unprecedented pressure. ASEAN member states, many of which share contested boundaries with China, might be forced to reevaluate their diplomatic stances. The situation could undermine ASEAN's consensus-based approach, pushing the bloc into a more security-oriented role. A potential conflict between the Philippines and China over the South China Sea represents one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the modern world. The consequences would be devastating on multiple fronts: economically, geopolitically, and in terms of human lives. The fragile peace in Southeast Asia hinges on a delicate balance, where any misstep could ignite a conflagration that neither side truly desires. For the Philippines, standing firm in the face of Chinese encroachment is a matter of national sovereignty. Yet it also brings the risk of entering a conflict with a superpower capable of overwhelming its military defenses. The U.S.-Philippines alliance remains a potent deterrent, though it does not eliminate the risk of miscalculation or escalation. As Southeast Asia faces the prospect of militarization and economic uncertainty, the world watches closely, aware that the fate of the South China Sea could shape the contours of global power for generations to come. In a world that appears to be sliding into a new Cold War, the South China Sea stands as a microcosm of the larger struggle for power and influence. Whether peace can be preserved will depend on the choices made by the leaders of both China and the Philippines, as well as by those of other major powers who have a stake in maintaining stability in this critical region. Thank you for tuning into our channel. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis of global issues.